it's a newly dangerous chemical, we must ban. Banning is a problem under this. It's been a problem in many of the cases we can look at, where governments ban a dangerous chemical and they get in trouble. Or you have a financial crisis. You have to re-regulate, tighten the regulations on the banks so you don't have another one. And each time the crisis is for a different reason, right? So you have to close a new loophole. And the same for climate change. Now we know about climate change. We want to restrict the emissions of the factories so they don't put out too much carbon dioxide. So these kinds of reasons for changing, and especially in developing countries, often we need to change our laws more because we might not yet have all the laws. Does Malaysia have a noise pollution law that says no construction in the residential area after midnight? If we don't have yet, then we need to introduce. And then as we are developing, we need to change our laws and regulations. The economy changes, the society changes, the ability of the government to regulate changes. So usually developing countries need to change their laws more than the developed country. So this fair and equitable treatment standstill can be even more of a problem for developing countries if they cannot change their laws and regulations. You could even think about making anti-corruption laws tougher, raising the minimum wage. We'll come to those cases. So that's not the only right the foreign investors have in this investment chapter. There is also a provision saying you must not expropriate the foreign investor. This in the old days was about the government nationalising the company. If you remember, like when Iran became independent or something, they nationalised British Petroleum, they take it over. So that's direct expropriation. If you take over the company or the land, you must pay compensation. So in Malaysia, you have some version of that in your, if the government builds a highway, right, and my house is in the way, and he's got to bulldoze my house, he must pay me compensation. But in most countries, I think in Malaysia too, it's just for land, right? It's not for your patents, it's not for your profits, your future profits, your expected profits, just land. In the TPP, remember the broad definition of investment. If you expropriate his profits, his future profits, his patent, can you think about something called tax? Tax sounds like it expropriates his profits. So they had to have an exception for that. Because the other second type of expropriation in the TPP is what we call indirect expropriation. Direct is you're taking the title, you nationalise it, now the government owns the factory. Indirect is Ed still owns the factory. The Singaporean investor Ed still owns the factory, but I, the Malaysian government, have reduced the value of his investment because I made him put a scrubber on the chimney so it doesn't have carbon dioxide, because I made him raise the minimum wage, because I made him stop polluting the river. I haven't taken over his factory, but I've reduced the value of his investment, which is his profits, by my laws and regulations, so indirect expropriation. Expropriation, direct or indirect, must pay fair market value compensation plus interest at a commercially reasonable rate because you have harmed the foreign investor. So the fair and equitable treatment, it used to be they used expropriation more when they were suing. Now they use fair and equitable treatment. In the US free trade agreements and investment treaties, I think 74% of the time when they sue on fair and equitable treatment. 81% of the time when they allege it, they win. They almost always win on this. And how is it that they enforce these rules? They enforce so most of the TPP is enforced by the governments suing each other. So if Malaysia signs and the TPP comes into force and Malaysia doesn't comply with the services chapter or the export taxes, the US government can sue the Malaysian government at an international court or tribunal. Malaysian government would lose. The US government could raise the tariffs, the taxes, on Malaysian exports of electronics, clothes to the US until Malaysia changes its law to comply. So very enforceable compared to your human rights treaty, your labor treaty, your environment treaty, right? Nothing happens if you don't comply with those, right? Nobody sues you, no tariffs, no nothing. This one has economic sanctions. So if they clash and the government has a choice, do I comply with my environment, my human rights treaty, or do I comply with the TPP? Most governments comply TPP because economic sanctions if you don't. And so even though they're supposed to be equal in international law, TPP has the economic sanctions. These environment, labor, human rights, no sanctions one, never mind. And so this means that even if your constitution violates the TPP, you have to change your constitution. Otherwise, tariffs on your exports until your exporters are crying, then they will say, change lah. So very enforceable, generally, the chapters. Investment chapter has another layer of enforcement. Not just governments sue each other, but the foreign investor, the American company, Philip Morris in Malaysia, can sue the Malaysian government at the International Tribunal. Actually, not Philip Morris, there's an exception. Linus can sue the Malaysian government at an international tribunal for money, unlimited monetary damages. No maximum in the TPP. So one government lost a case last year, I think, and had to pay the foreign investor $50 billion US, 50 billion US dollars. They had 180 days to find the money. Malaysian government got or not spare 180 billion to just like this, like this? I can donate. So that's the damages. In addition to that, pay the investor interest. And in the TPP, this interest can be compound interest, interest on the interest, not compounded once a year, compounded every month from the date the government took the action 5 years ago at commercial borrowing rates, not government borrowing rates. So the interest alone can be $500 million US, just in interest. Then you pay the lawyers to defend you, right? You hire the international law firm, you pay them $1,000 an hour. The Philippines so far has spent $58 million US defending one case. And usually you think, when I win the case, at least the other fella pays my lawyers, right? By rights. No. In this system, when you look historically, when the governments win, 70% of the time when they win, they still have to pay their own lawyers. Still out of pocket, $58 million just in defending the case, even though you won. But if the investor wins, he only has to pay his own lawyers 40% of the time. So this is the unbiased International ISDS Tribunal. This is their track record of who has to pay the legal fees. So this investor-to-state dispute settlement is very controversial because I will give you some of the examples of the cases. For those of you who are interested in what happens if a government is elected and they want to carry out the platform on which they were elected, this is exactly what happened in New Zealand. New Zealand, the left-wing Labour Party government was elected on a platform of keeping New Zealand culture strong by having local content on TV. This means a certain number of hours per day of New Zealand-made programs. And they have the same policy in Australia, even though they are English-speaking countries, because they don't want the American programs 24 hours a day. Even though same language, they say we want our own accents, our own Indigenous people, our own history, our own stories. And the reason they have to do this is because an American-made program like Friends, right, the sitcom, they sell it in America. It's 300 million population or something, right? By the time they sell in America, they have covered the cost of production, right? So they can export to Australia and New Zealand for very cheap. The program is cheaper than the New Zealand-made sitcom or drama or documentary, and the same for Australia. So both Australia and New Zealand wanted to have how many hours per day locally made programs. Actually, Malaysia also has for radio and TV and advertising. And so New Zealand did not have. The Labour Party was elected on a platform, New Zealand culture, we will put back local content. But the New Zealand government, previous government, the right-wing neoliberal one, had locked open this sector in the International Trade Organization, the World Trade Organization, and so they couldn't have local content because they had said, we give market access in every service sector, so you can have as many American programs on New Zealand TV as you want. So even though the New Zealand Labour Party was elected on a platform of local government, they got into government, they asked for an opinion from the government lawyers, can we do it this way, can we do it this way? All 4 options, illegal. And they couldn't change it, because to change it, you have to get the consent of all the other guys. And so this has happened in a number of places. I think there was a Polish privatization that was very unpopular. After the end of the Cold War, everything was privatized. They got halfway through the privatization of something very sensitive, I think health insurance. And then the people said, alamak, this is a bad idea. We don't want to sell all of this off. And so the party was elected on don't privatize the rest of it. But they were elected, they said we're going to stop it, and they got sued under ISDS for the lost profits the fellow would have made. So for those of you who think, new government elected, we stop Linus, kick them out. Linus has shareholders from TPP countries. If you kick them out, then if they had a license, say, for 20 years, and every year they were going to make $1 million, and now you stop them, newly elected government on a platform to stop Linus, democracy in action. Okay, I kick out Linus, I've been elected. Linus can say, well, I would have made $1 million for the remaining 20 years of my permit. Now I can't make my $1 million a year. I have lost profits $20 million. You pay me back the $20 million I would have made because you cancelled my permit. So we see this, for example, even if the investor breaks the law. So there was a famous case in Ecuador where the oil company broke the law. And when you break the law in Ecuador for this thing, the law says you can punish by cancelling the permit. So Ecuador cancelled the permit. The oil company sued the Ecuador government under the equivalent provisions as has been agreed in the TPP that TOCPA will sign next month, and they won. Ecuador must pay the lawbreaker $2.4 billion because the investment chapter of the TPP is about the rights of the investor. Doesn't matter if the investor has done something wrong, not clean hands, broken the law, doesn't matter. The investor always has his rights. And if the rights of the investor are infringed, he can sue and he can win. So I don't know anybody interested, separation of powers, independent judiciary. Okay, so then the Chevron case. So again, Ecuador. Chevron polluted the rainforest, you probably remember, in the Amazon. 30,000 indigenous people sued class action. They sued Chevron in the Ecuador courts and they won. $18 billion fine on Chevron to clean up. Chevron didn't want to pay. They sued the Ecuador government under the investment chapter, saying this court decision, expropriating their profits, what? He was going to make profits and now he must pay the fine. So that case is not decided yet. But along the way, the ISDS tribunal, the same kind that Malaysia can be sued at in the TPP, ordered the Ecuador executive branch of government, the president, to interfere with his courts to stop the $18 billion fine on Chevron becoming final. Ecuador has separation of powers like Malaysia. The executive is not supposed to interfere with the courts. In Ecuador, if the president does it, he goes to jail. Never mind, the ISDS tribunal repeatedly ordered the president to put himself in jail by interfering in his own court system. There is no constitutional safeguard for separation of powers. For those of you who want to know about the environment, in Canada, they tried to comply with the Basel Convention on transboundary movement of hazardous waste, and so they put a moratorium on the waste going out to see that they were complying. For 16 months, they didn't let it go out. The investor who wanted the waste to process sued the Canadian government under the same provisions, basically, that Malaysia has agreed in the TPP, and they won. The lost profits they would have made for the 16-month moratorium, even though Canada was doing it to check compliance with an international environment treaty that Malaysia has also joined, by the way. Not clear that Malaysia can still comply with this environmental treaty anymore. So even when you do it to comply with an environment treaty or a human rights treaty, it doesn't get you off the hook. The investor can still sue and can still win. And lastly, those of you who are interested in anti-corruption, there's a lot of cases. I'm just giving you some of the ones that are interesting maybe for you. In India, I don't know if you remember, they had a 2G phone license scandal. You remember 2G, 3G, 4G? That spectrum is limited, right? Limited amount. All the phone companies want it. So you auction it and you make a lot of revenue for the government, billions of dollars by rights. In India, for 2G, the minister just gave out the licenses, no auction. He was tried for corruption, he went to jail for corruption. The Indian government said, we cancel the licenses that were given corruptly because corruption, what? We lost billions of potential revenue. The investors who corruptly got those licenses are suing the Indian government for billions of dollars of lost profits they would have made if they could have kept their corrupt licenses. One has already won. Indian government must pay the corrupt fella $672 million US. Pay the corrupt fellow, pay the lawbreaker, pay the environmental polluter. The opposite of what you normally think, don't pay the polluter. This is the investment chapter. So those of you who might have noticed that in the TPP there is an environment chapter, there is a labor chapter, we think very nice, right? Well, the labor chapter does have some labor rights. The labor chapter itself is quite vague, but in the side letter, the labor consistency plan between Malaysia and the US, it gets a bit more specific about human trafficking and so on. And it's enforceable by governments suing each other. The problem is the US government, number one, it's only between Malaysia and the US. So the Australian government cannot sue Malaysia because of Malaysia's violation of labor rights. Only the US government can sue, I guess, because it's bilateral, right? So the US government doesn't sue about these labor rights. They have sued once, Guatemala, after all the trade unions lobbied and lobbied. You might know there's a Colombia-US free trade agreement. Colombia murders their trade unionists regularly. They murder their trade unionists, still the US doesn't sue under the Colombia-US free trade agreement labor chapter. Even though murdering your trade unionists, clear violation of labor rights, doesn't get any clearer than that, you killed the fella. No, the US government decides not to sue. So this is even under a Democrat president. Can you imagine the Republicans get into power who hate labor rights? No way they're going to sue Malaysia to enforce the labor chapter and the labor side letter. So even though it's there, it's basically on paper because only governments can sue. The trade unionists cannot sue. The trafficked worker cannot sue. Not like the investor, he can sue. But the labor rights only enforceable between governments. And if the US government chooses not to sue, nothing that can do to enforce it. So in addition, the investment chapter can effectively override the labor chapter because there was a case after the Arab Spring in Egypt where the government said, the people have spoken. We are going to raise the minimum wage. Let's go for democracy and, power to the people. They raised the minimum wage. They got sued by a foreign investor who said, you are reducing my profits, what? Now I must pay these workers more money. That case is not yet decided, but it has made the trade unions so upset that now they are really, really campaigning against investor-to-state dispute settlement. So you raise the minimum wage, you are reducing his profits, he can sue. So because of this, you were asking about TTIP. Somebody here was interested in TTIP is the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement being negotiated between the US and the EU. And in this investor-to-state dispute settlement that I've been talking about that enforces the investment chapter has become very controversial. It used to be the German government who was the first one to sign these investment treaties to protect the investors' rights. But the German government got sued twice recently, and they learned their lesson. The first time was about a coal-fired electricity plant that was in Hamburg or somewhere. It was set up a few years ago. Then the Stern report came out on climate change. And the German government read it and they said, oh, alamak, there's a thing called climate change. We better start restricting our coal-fired power plants, require them to do this environmental stuff, don't mess up the fish in the river. They got sued by the power plant and they settled. They removed their environmental requirements. The German government said, okay, you carry on. The second time the German government got sued by the same company was after Fukushima. You remember the Fukushima nuclear disaster, huh? After that, nuclear power became very unpopular in Germany. Nobody wanted it anymore. The government listened to the people, democracy. They said, okay, we phase out nuclear power. We don't stop it tomorrow, but we don't renew the power plants' contracts. They got sued for 4 billion euros by one company that has 2 power plants or something, not even all the power plants. That case is not yet decided, but it's caused such a ruckus in the German government that they now say, maybe we shouldn't agree to this ISDS with the Americans in the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement.